Soy José Gordon, bienvenidos a la ALEPH, el Festival de Arte y Ciencia organizado por la UNAM. Hoy vamos a tener un encuentro con el doctor Keith Wallace, quien es un investigador pionero en el estudio de la conciencia, reconocido internacionalmente por sus estudios sobre meditación trascendental. Sus estudios, sus investigaciones iniciales fueron publicadas en la revista Science, en la revista American Journal of Physiology y Scientific American. Su investigación en la ayurveda, que es el sistema antiguo de medicina de la India, han abierto el interés de la comunidad científica en un nuevo paradigma de la medicina mente-cuerpo y del desarrollo del cerebro. Es un gran honor, un gran gusto tener aquí en el ALEPH, el Festival de Ciencia y Arte de la UNAM, al doctor Keith Wallace para hablarnos sobre las fronteras de la medicina. Bienvenido, doctor Keith Wallace. Let's start by talking about your seminal research on a new state of consciousness of perception. We were used to think that all that we live has to do with 3 states of consciousness. What propelled a scientist like you, trained at UCLA, to do research in this realm?
I guess I've always been interested in consciousness. And I had the great opportunity of meeting Maharishi Mahesh Yogi at quite a young age and learning transcendental meditation. I was a physics student at the time. And then I just decided what a great opportunity. Nobody really had done research on this particular technique of meditation. They'd done research on Zen, on different types of yoga. But so I had this really golden opportunity to do my PhD thesis on what the physiological effects were during transcendental meditation. So I could measure the EEG, I could measure oxygen consumption, I could measure blood, variables in the blood. And what I was able to show was that the changes were distinct from, as you said, waking, dreaming, or sleeping states. Every state of consciousness has its corresponding physiological state. And this was something that was a wonderful opportunity, and I was able to spend many years studying it. At the university I'm at, we've had $25 million worth of grants from the National Institutes of Health to study the effects of transcendental meditation on hypertension. And many different papers have been published since those early days. It's a very highly researched area on so many different aspects, and it's a kind of a window into consciousness to understand the physiological correlates of higher states of consciousness.
And what were your findings? You explored something very interesting, because in Sanskrit, this state of alertness while being restful is called turiya. That means deferred. That means that it was codified even in ancient times that we had different states of consciousness. Let's talk about this state of consciousness and what were your findings in terms of the alertness and the hypometabolic state you found.
Exactly. Well, you're right. This has been in so many different traditions, particularly in the Vedic tradition of India, but you see many, many different accounts of people having this experience of where their whole body goes into a deep state of rest. Their breathing is just almost suspended. And yet when you look at the EEG activity in the brain, you find out that it's this alpha wave activity, which indicates a relaxed activity, particularly in the front part of the brain. And most interestingly, you see that there is a correlation between different parts of the brain, what we call EEG coherence. And it basically means that one part of the brain knows what the other part is doing. And I really think that this research documents something very important. All of these different traditions have talked about these experiences, but it was really Maharishi who came out with that it was neurophysiological refinement. we know that every experience changes our brain. Just talking right now, anything I do, if I play tennis, I play the piano, you can see changes in the brain. So every experience you have changes your brain. But most of the time in our life, we don't transcend, we don't go beyond the surface level of thinking and go to that source of thought. And during transcendental meditation, that's what the experience is. And then you see this very integrated state in the brain, highly coherent state. And as people continue to meditate, you not only see it during meditation, but you see it outside of meditation. And people have talked about this in all kinds of languages, flow, this kind of effortless state. Athletes talk about it. It's a state in which the different parts of the brain are beautifully connected, but the body's in a very relaxed state. And, you can study during, and that my initial research was what happens during. You can look at plasma lactate. That's a particular chemical that's associated with anxiety, and you see that it decreases. You can see all kinds of the skin response, heart rate, breath rate, the whole autonomic nervous system. But I find even more interesting are the later studies that look at what happens when you do this twice a day as a habit, a very simple habit, practicing your meditation with your eyes closed, sitting comfortably, just 20 minutes twice a day. What are the long-term effects on the physiology? We know, for example, people that have high blood pressure goes down. We find all kinds of different disease conditions that are improved. But for me, the most interesting is how we experience stress. This is a very, very important thing in our world today.
In the pandemic world.
It is the pandemic world, and stress increases a particular hormone called cortisol. All kinds of other chemical changes are going on in the body. And there are certain parts of the brain, one part called the amygdala, almost in the center of our brain, which is interpreting, is it a snake? Is it a string? And if it's a snake, the information no longer goes to the frontal part of the brain where you would reason and logic. It sets off an emergency reaction, goes to the hippocampus, to the autonomic nervous system. And now suddenly you're in alert mode. And this one chemical that's secreted by the adrenal glands, it's actually a hormone, cortisol, increases. But that's okay. We're supposed to react to stress. We're supposed to be alert. What's dangerous is when these levels of cortisol stay high when the stress is gone. So now there's no stress and our cortisol levels are still high. And what does this do? Well, in the hippocampus, it's the one part of our brain that has to do with emotions and memory. It actually damages cells. And in our frontal part of the brain, it can change the way we react to stress. So we stop reacting in the same way. And in the amygdala, this part of the brain that is interpreting everything, it can heighten the reaction. So now our whole physiology is changing. We're overreacting to stress.
And flight or fight response.
Fight or flight response. But then when it's done, that's okay to have the fight or flight response. It's nothing wrong with the fight or flight response. What is wrong is when you have these after effects. The body doesn't come back to a resting state, but it stays agitated. And not only is the brain rewired so that you start to overreact to stress, but you also, if you look at the very, very fine level in the physiology, the level of the DNA, where all this information is coded in every cell, you find that there are molecular mechanisms, molecular pathways that are altered by the stress over and over. And certain genes are turned on, certain genes are turned off. And that's really at a deep level in our physiology. And that happens in these very specific parts of the brain. You also see it with addiction. If somebody is addicted to alcohol or cigarettes or drugs, you also see these molecular changes, just like in stress, where one gene is turned on, another gene is turned off. So these are serious long-term changes in our brain, in our DNA, and really our whole physiology, because it's not just the brain, but the brain is connected to the gut. It's connected to the immune system. We have what's called a gut-brain axis. So you react to stress, that affects everything in the body. The immune system gets dampened, our gut gets changed, the digestive system gets changed, blood pressure goes up. So these long-term changes are what are so serious, and people have talked about them as neuroadaptive responses or neuroadaptability. How do I react to stress? And that's really important, especially in a pandemic, because the stress level's gone up now. It's much, much higher. And, there's nothing easy. I mean, we don't know if we're going to get it, not. Our jobs, economics, everything is creating this stress on us. And that's when we need to have this resilience, this neuroadaptability. We need to be strong so that we can deal with whatever changes are taking place in our outside environment. And that comes from creating coherence inside the body, in the brain, in the whole body itself, and even in the digestive system and the gut, where we have the microbiome. Nobody even knew about this 10 years ago, but now we know it has a huge effect on the brain. They're all connected. The immune system, the endocrine, the gut bacteria, our brain. So we have to be careful. We know everything we eat, how we sleep, how we exercise, even meditation itself can change, can turn on one gene, can turn off another. And we want to go from this poor neuroadaptability where we start to damage parts of the brain and overreact to stress. We have digestive problems. We have high blood pressure. We want to go to effective neuroadaptability where we can be resilient. We react to stress. That's important. We have to be able to react to stress. But then we have to come back to this very relaxed inner state of peace and have greater resilience in dealing with a world which obviously is getting more stressful all the time.
Let's talk about how neuroadaptability affects health from the perspective of modern science and Ayurveda, because you also have studied the ancient system medicine of Ayurveda.
I have. I've been very interested. The meditation and Ayurveda, they're connected. And Ayurveda is the traditional system of medicine in India. And in the past, we've only heard about certain herbs and, not much more. Now Maharishi, when he revived Ayurveda, he really pointed out something that had always been there. And that was, it talks a lot about consciousness. It includes meditation. It has very profound techniques like a pulse diagnosis, where you can actually evaluate what's going on. And it really does have a scientific basis. New research is coming out every day to show it's really interesting that, they identify people in different types. So they have what they call prakriti, which is kind of a mind-body type. So one person is very creative, maybe tall and thin, and just very moving quickly, so fantastic. Maybe a marketing person or an advertising person, really good at that, musician. And then another person is sort of more fiery, more kind of, purposeful, wanting to get careful planning. I want to get this goal. I want to get it done. And then finally, the other person is a little more calm, more methodical, takes a little more time to do things, but really does them very, very well. Good administrator. So they understood that people were different. And now there's scientific research which shows that these three types, which are called vata, pitta, and kapha, they have a genetic basis. So you can actually look at the people that are identified in this system as a vata prakriti and find that they have a certain set of genes turned on, and the pitta having another set of genes, and the kapha as another. And they knew, what's really interesting, they understood that everything we do affects the genes. This is called epigenetics. And epigenetics is huge right now. The foods we eat this particular food, it not only affects the digestive system and the microbiome, but it also can turn genes on and off in the body. So like, oh, food's more important than we thought. Food is medicine. If I exercise, that'll turn some genes on and off. If I meditate, that will turn genes on and off. If I sleep, that will affect the genes. So this is huge. This means everything we do in life is affecting not only our brain, our neurological pathways, but our molecular pathways. And they understood this. They had this kind of knowledge. And so I think today we need to go back and look at these traditional systems of medicine. They're so oriented toward prevention, really beautiful. Not, prevent the disease from arising, create a strong physiology. This coherence in the physiology, this inner stability, gives you the basis for being more flexible, more adaptable, more resilient.
And what is interesting is that the frontiers of medicine are now being researched by science, but also by ancient medicine. Let's talk about what frontiers Ayurveda can explore that we haven't been able to do it, and how can we prove that through the lenses of modern science?
Yeah, it's very important. This one I talked about, where you can look at the genome, you can look and correlate the genome with the Ayurveda Prakriti. That's a very good one. So right away, you can see that people are different. And modern medicine is recognizing that. There's a whole area of personalized medicine where people examine the DNA. There's something in the United States called P4, and one of the 4 Ps is personalized. And then it has things like participatory and preventive and predictive. So modern medicine is kind of finding connections. The microbiome is huge. I mean, you see a paper almost every day on these gut bacteria. I mean, we used to think bacteria in the gut, that's bad for you. And now all of a sudden we're being told this is very important. And Ayurveda understood this concept many thousands of years ago. They had the very fundamental idea that all disease really begins in the gut. That if you have a headache, oh, do I look to the brain? No. First of all, look to the gut, because it's digestion, it's the gut lining, it's how we're processing the food, and the microbiome, which is residing there, which then influences the brain. I mean, we now know that the microbiome affects almost every disease. And the biggest thing that affects the microbiome is food. I mean, antibiotics can hurt it, that's for sure. There are different things that can hurt it. But if you want to change the microbiome, simple, just eat a different diet. You'll get a different microbiome. So this, I think, is something that Ayurveda understood. And I think because we now know about the microbiome, we have these techniques that can do gene sequencing, suddenly we can understand Ayurveda from a scientific perspective. And of course, all the research on meditation, it's part of Ayurveda, part of yoga. So we're really expanding the sphere of the connection between these ancient sciences and arts and modern sciences interpretation of what's going on.
And in this way, the frontiers of medicine are expanding. And you know, what is very interesting is to know that when you interact with all these ancient trained doctors in India, it's very interesting to see how did they diagnose. I've seen you with some of these doctors. You know them in a personal basis, like for example, Dr. Raju or Dr. Triguna.
Right.
Let's talk about the experience you had with them sharing knowledge from two different traditions.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to take some of these, Dr. Triguna, for example, to see the directors of the National Institutes of Health in the United States. We went to China, we visited the heads of their medicine. We actually went all around the world visiting very top people. And Dr. Triguna would take the pulse. He took the pulse of one of these directors of the National Institute. They said, "Oh, you recently passed a kidney stone." And the guy said, "Well, how do you know that? How could you possibly know that?" And it's this amazing technology that they have to comprehend what's going on in the physiology in a very fundamental way. So there's a huge new discoveries to be made here. And I think, you know, a lot to be offered to modern medicine. This frontiers of medicine needs to be an integration between the very old and the very new. And we have to come with an open heart and an open mind and listen to what they're doing and saying, and then we can study it. That's wonderful. And then we can understand it from a scientific perspective. And we now have the tools to do that, like gene sequencing allows us to do things we couldn't do before. So there's enormous opportunities for huge discoveries here, just like meditation, microbiome, food, all the different herbs they use, all the different lifestyle changes they do. Some really simple things I think could have very profound implications for modern medicine.
And nowadays we have better instruments to see what happens in the brain. Yeah. Let's talk about the most recent research in the coherence aspects of the brain, because you know EEG registers were like trying to know what happens in a city from an helicopter.
Yes.
But you don't have the exact perspective of what is really happening there. You just know if there is flow, there is no traffic. If there is no noise, then there is no traffic, but you don't know actually what is happening. Let's talk about these correlations that are very interesting, because they are just correlations. They don't really capture or grasp what is happening inside, but the techniques are more sophisticated each day.
Yeah, the brain imaging techniques are very powerful because you can actually look and see, okay, during meditation, this area of the brain is being activated and this other area of the brain is quiet. So that's like a much more precise way. And there's many, many different studies been going, you know, that have been done using brain imaging techniques. So all of a sudden meditation is something people accept. Oh, yeah, I understand. Meditation is going to reduce stress. I like that. And there are studies that can show it changes parts of my brain. There's a whole thing called neuroplasticity too, which is how every experience changes the brain. So, and even with EEG, they have better techniques now of how to analyze the data, so it becomes more meaningful. But the combination of brain imaging, EEG, and I like neurochemistry. I really love the idea of trying to understand the chemical changes that are going on in the brain and in the body. And this is something that Ayurveda talks about. They say, when your digestion is very good, you produce ojas, and nobody knows what that is. It's a great opportunity to study it. I mean, here you can, what does that do? It's supposed to increase your the strength of your immune system. Well, it's good. Like a chemical that would increase the strength of my immune system. It's supposed to enliven parts of the brain so that you could have the experience of higher states of consciousness. That makes sense because we know that our whole physiology, our whole brain, our moods, different mental states, they're supported by different concentrations of chemicals in the brain. So yeah, you're right. There's terrific opportunities here. We're just starting in this wonderful journey into consciousness.
And when you study that, the very important thing is that we are having glimpses of what other states of consciousness we can have.
Yes.
Let's talk about that because, for example, the historian Yuval Harari would say that we have, with a very good sense of humor, he said that we think that Homo sapiens is equal to Homer Simpson. And that's the level of perception we can have. Yeah. But we have the registers, also the recordings of art that says that there are more possibilities of awareness. Let's talk about higher states of consciousness. What does this mean? And how can we prove it also through the lenses of science? Aldous Huxley, for example, would have essays along the lines of seeing how the doors of perception can be opened. But where we stand nowadays with the advancements of science?
Well, the interesting thing is that people have begun to accept these ideas more. That helps, there's a shift in the paradigm. So at one time, this was considered very odd, very strange, maybe just a few people in India or somebody in the Mayan tradition had these experiences, and what were they induced by chemicals or whatever. But nowadays you go around and it's perfectly legitimate to study meditation. It's perfectly acceptable to study the notion of higher states of consciousness. So the world has come a long ways. Yoga is completely accepted now. So we're now, Aldous Huxley would be happy. He talked about drinking soma, and that was, he had one of his worlds where people drank soma. But see, now people want to understand that. They'd like to know, what is the biochemistry of higher states of consciousness? Is there some chemical that supports it? They talk about flow. They talk in business, they talk about it. How do you increase performance? How do you become, a top businessman has a lot of stress. He's got many, many things going on. How does he operate to be creative, to work well with other people? So all of a sudden now, the science has become more open to studying these different states. And they study it with brain imaging, they study it with different biochemicals, and they connect it to disease also. There was one study which was done by Dr. Robert Schneider at our university, where they looked at a couple hundred people who had had heart attacks. And then they assigned one group to practice transcendental meditation, another to do health education. And they studied them over a 5-year period. And they looked at very serious things. How many of these people had heart attacks again? How many had strokes? How many died? And what they found was there was a 47% reduction in the risk in the people that started transcendental meditation. Now, if you had a pill that could reduce your heart attacks by 47%, it would be $1 billion pill. So why not use meditation to do it. And I think that the world is beginning to accept that. And so now we are able to talk about higher states of consciousness. It's always been in philosophy. It's always been in kind of religion or mysticism. But there are people that are studying it now. And they're studying, Andrew Newberg, he's done many papers on what he calls the experience of God and what does it mean in terms of the brain. So this is a legitimate area of research now that's growing because one, people are having these experiences more and we're accepting them. Meditation, yoga, these words are now not, people are happy to go to a yoga studio. They're happy to learn meditation. And scientists have better tools to study it, particularly these molecular tools. I mean, if you can study addiction, alcohol, and cigarettes, and you can find that there are these very fine mechanisms in your DNA in the cell that are being turned on and off, then you can use those same studies to study the opposite end. And that's fine. That's the bad state. Why not study the optimal health, where somebody is really experiencing life to their fullness? Then we look and see, okay, which genes are being turned on and off, which transcriptional mechanisms are being altered. It's a fantastic opportunity right now.
Is what Abraham Maslow would call peak experiences. Yes.
Yes.
We are used to study the more not refined levels of experience, but peak experiences we haven't studied it, and then we are trying to correlate it with serotonin levels. It's very interesting what is happening there.
Yeah, and to correlate it with health too. I mean, you know, at one time this may not have been considered in the realm of modern medicine, but now we're saying, no, these people in these ancient traditions, they understood the body and mind and the connection, and they were people at peace, and they knew that the mind could affect the body, and they knew that what you ate made a difference. And so they had specific practices. They understood how foods affected us, how herbs, how mental states affected us. So this is very important for modern medicine. Higher states of consciousness, not just philosophy, higher states of consciousness is important for modern medicine because we are taking on more stress all the time. There's no doubt about it. I mean, what a corporate executive has to do, or even a normal individual in COVID, what they have to do, it's very stressful. So they need a stronger immune system. They need greater adaptability, greater resilience. So that's what's most interesting, is that we're taking these mystical ideas and we're bringing them suddenly into the realm of modern medicine, that they could actually help our health.
And you know, this has to do with the mind-body studies. And what is very interesting is really to try to understand what happens there, why mind influences body, because we know, of course, that body also influences mind, but which was first, the egg or the chicken? No?
Yeah, well,
so
go ahead.
Yes. No, please.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, we know now, maybe it's, you know, we're picking the wrong topic, but we know stress, you know, can disrupt the immune system. So if somebody is under stress, their body becomes weaker. You know, chronic stress, I'm talking about here. Just a momentary stress, your body recovers pretty quickly. But if you're in a chronic stress state, that weakens the immune system, affects things like blood pressure. It affects all of our digestive system because they are connected. We now know a lot more, many more chemicals that both send messages from the gut to the brain and from the brain to the gut. We have this vagus nerve. We know that's a huge highway of information going back and forth. But so now the understanding of what the mechanisms might be is becoming a little more, within the grasp of a scientist. So it's not mystical. Now it's scientific. I can measure what's happening in your body. I can look at when you do this, you eat this food, which genes get turned on. And so this is terrific. This means we can really look at all these traditions and begin to comprehend what they've been trying to tell us and why prevention is so important.
What you're telling us is the easy problem in trying to understand what happens between mind and body.
That's
to try
true.
to find the correlates. But
Right.
the hard problem is to try to understand how, like the late Nobel Prize Gerald Edelman said, how is that matter becomes imagination?
Yes.
But you are implying that there is another paradigm. Let's talk about it, because the frontiers of knowledge, the frontiers of medicine would look different if we change of paradigm, and if that change of paradigm is supported by science. So let's talk about what new paradigm is implied in these experiences and in the understanding and the research you have been doing.
Okay. I mean, let's first of all recognize that even within our current paradigm, we can understand meditation, Ayurveda, even if we don't accept all these, we take the easy problem and we say, oh, there's a correlation between every physiological state and every state of consciousness. Okay, even within this current paradigm, we can understand why things like meditation, why Ayurveda are valuable to our health. Now, if you want to go further into these traditions, they take a different approach than modern science. Modern science will really tell you, okay, your brain, your consciousness is an epiphenomena. It's somehow all these neural pathways, starting from our DNA and then creating these neural networks, enables us to have consciousness. Nobody's able to answer how that works, but it's an emergent property. We use that word emergent because we don't actually know from A to B how it works. But still, that's the paradigm we live in now. If you go into these traditions, these ancient traditions, most of them, like the Vedic tradition of India, have a totally different paradigm where consciousness is the primordial energy of the universe. That consciousness is a substance that, well, it's not even a substance, it's just pure information, pure energy. And from that comes matter. Now, that's not so far off from modern physics. I mean, modern physics, if you look at the world, you can treat it classically, or you can treat it from a quantum mechanical perspective. And when you go to the deepest levels of modern physics, there are all kinds of phenomena there that are completely wild. Entanglement, how one thing can know, one part of the universe knows what somebody else is doing, how you can be a particle or a wave. Quantum mechanics disturbed science. Nobody could completely understand it. And there were many great physicists that did say this deepest level of physics really, it's so close to consciousness. And they have many, different hard problems there, talking about measuring and the role of consciousness. So again, it's not completely an Eastern tradition or some philosophical idea. Even among the greatest physicists in the world, they have questioned what is really the relationship between matter and consciousness. Does matter come first, or does consciousness come first? Because they're looking at such fine levels. There is no matter there. It's just pure energy. pure information at these very, very fundamental levels. So it's neurophysiologists like myself who have the problem, because we're the ones who are stuck with, well, how do you explain states of consciousness? Oh, you say they come from the combination of neural activity. And if I was to go into a lecture and say, no, your whole nervous system comes from consciousness, I'd be laughed out of the room. Nobody would like that at all because they live in a different paradigm. If I went to a group of physicists, I might find one or two that would be slightly sympathetic to me. But it's a big step. It's a big, big, big step to really change the paradigm and really understand that the world is nothing but consciousness. But all these ancient traditions said that. That's been a basic tenet of these traditions. And they've also said it's not just belief, but you can experience it in meditation. So we're at a crossroads right now. We're at a time when the world is changing. And I know you interviewed Dr. Tony Nader, and he has a new book out, One Unbounded Ocean of Consciousness. And he presents this beautifully. That book is in Spanish too. And it's, I think, you know, we're at a crossroads. I think we're at a new time in the world where, even though there's still many, many, many people over here, especially scientists, who don't agree, there's still now a group that are really exploring this. Dr. John Hagelin has written some beautiful articles, a very top physicist on this, dark matter, dark energy. There's so many ways we can think about these ancient concepts now that we could never think about before.
You know, it's very interesting because the poet's intuition was almost the same, to see the world as an inconceivable universe. The poet Jorge Luis Borges would say that we are living in an inconceivable world. And that's what physicists are also understanding, yes?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think, you know, many, many great poets and philosophers, Wordsworth describes a beautiful experience where his body, he describes essentially his body is in a state of rest, complete rest, no breathing, no anything, but his mind is expanded. And certainly Walt Whitman has described this. Einstein described states like this. So people have had these experiences, but they've been odd experiences. You'll get even great neurophysiologists, you know, we'll talk about near-death experiences or strokes or things like that. And they'll speculate. They'll say, well, I had this experience. It's just that, and now they write whole books on it. So it's getting better. There's more and more opportunity to talk about it. It's just that the experiences themselves has not been a reliable technique to have the experience. So it was just once, you know, in a lifetime.
We are talking about a technique, not about a belief. That's the difference.
That's right. So I think that's the important thing. Now that meditation is something accepted, now that you can have a technique like transcendental meditation, that you can have that experience of transcending, then now it's possible for a group of people to have that experience, compare their notes, and really use this. You know, in the Vedic technology, the Vedic scientist used the mind as a laboratory, and he explored consciousness. He asked nature questions. And this is the poet. I mean, this, like you said, this is what a great poet does. Well, this is the kind of description of a Vedic scientist too. They'd have these cognitions of how nature works in their own mind, in their own consciousness. That was the real scientist of ancient times.
The laboratory is our own brain and our billions of neurons.
It is.
There we have a technology of the inner world.
Yeah, and it's just a question of rewiring the brain, because we're so used to going outward. Our whole life is directed outward. So when we go inward, suddenly the brain starts to rewire itself. And it takes time because it's physical. It's not something just mental, it's physical. So when you change one neural pathway, another pathway here, that is physical. So it may take some years to rewire the brain so we can have those experiences more consistently. But we have the technology to do it.
You know, you have an example, a very beautiful example that has to do with the wiring of the ice cats, an experiment that has been done by Hubel and Wiesel.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's a great, thank you for bringing that up. That's a beautiful experiment because essentially it tells you how experience changes the brain. If these animals are brought up in an environment which doesn't have certain stimuli, those never get wired into the brain. They don't see it. If it's something like horizontal lines or something, if that's left out of the experience of these young animals, their brains get rewired in such a way that they don't have the capacity for that experience. Now, we as humans seem to have greater flexibility. We don't, there's not some critical period of development where things can't be reversed. We can reverse things all the time. We have new neurons being created, new pathways all the time. So it's a beautiful idea. It basically means that we create the reality we live in. It's based on our experiences of the world. If we experience the world in a certain way, that's like putting on a certain kind of glasses. We see the world through these red lenses. If we experience the world differently, our brain gets rewired, and now we see the world through our golden glasses because it's wired into the brain. It's not just some mood, it's not just some little change here. It's really changes in the way the brain is wired.
And you know, in this sense, you had had some personal experiences while doing your practice of meditation that opened up to more to different landscapes of what reality is. But there is an experience you had with the Himalayas that's very interesting. Please tell us about it, please.
Well, I was with a good friend and we were in Nepal. I was giving a speech to the, I was young, you know, I was only like 24, and I was speaking to thousands of physiologists in India at this international conference. And I was speaking on the neurophysiology of enlightenment. And these were to my professors, you know, so that was quite a thing. But then I had a chance to go to Nepal. And in Nepal, we went to a lake, Lake Pokhara. Very pretty. And we were just floating in these little canoes on this lake, and we were flying a little kite, having fun, this other friend and I. And we were looking up to the mountains, and they looked so pretty. And I thought, oh, these are very nice mountains, very nice. And then all of a sudden, the clouds cleared, and you could see these huge mountains like Machu Picchu and Annapurna, these, oh God, just a different world. And I was just completely blown away by that experience. It was so breathtaking. I think Nepal is one of the most beautiful places in the world. And when you see those mountains, they just make you realize, you know, what the glory of nature, just phenomenal.
The vastness of the universe that we are starting to understand, and that you tackled with your research in higher states of consciousness, in new possibilities of perception. We thank you very, very much, Dr. Robert Keith Wallace, for sharing your knowledge and experience so generously here at the ALEPH Festival. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.